This is such an extraordinary privilege to be something that Carol Swain has organized. I take none of this for granted. I take none of you for granted. Thank you for coming. I take the students not for granted. Any kind of organization that is fighting back deserves enormous support, and for Carol to be both an academic and an organizer are skills that you don't often see together in the same person. So thank you so much. I thought I would briefly just tell you how I started writing about policing. It was the 1990s, and Rudolph Giuliani was transforming New York and destroying the poverty industrial complex and the criminal industrial complex. He was doing things that nobody believed were possible. This was when Giuliani was still a sane man and not a crazy man. And he brought crime down in 3, 4, 5 years in a way that nobody believed was possible. The FBI, in its annual crime reports, used to publish a disclaimer saying, well, of course, we all know that homicide is a social problem as a result of racism and poverty, and there's really nothing that police can do about it except respond after the fact. And Giuliani, as police commissioner, said, no, actually, we are going to lower crime. He set himself benchmarks, he met them, he exceeded them, and the New York Times was going nuts. They were saying that the only reason Giuliani has accomplished what he has done in the realm of crime is because he is abusing black New Yorkers. He has unleashed a reign of terror in minority communities. Well, I had not been a journalist for all that long, but I had learned something, which is that if the New York Times tells you something is true, be a little skeptical. Do some footwork. So I thought, okay, let me go see if this is true. This was the moment of a very tragic shooting in New York City. The Amadou Diallo shooting. This was the West Ghanaian immigrant who in 1999 was killed with 41 shots by a group of undercover officers. This had given the pretext for Al Sharpton, for Susan Sarandon, the rest of the entire intersectional left, to protest what Giuliani had done. And they were holding daily protests at City Hall, die-ins. The New York Times was running 3.5 stories a day on the racist New York Police Department. So I said, let me find out about this. And at that point, I knew nothing about policing. I didn't come from a law enforcement background. So I would go to high-crime communities, and I would accost people on the street, and I would say, do you feel oppressed by the police? And I'd be told again and again, a young Caribbean man who said, the police don't harass me because I'm a good boy. This is something you're not allowed to say. You are not allowed to say that one's own behavior has an effect on whether you have a police encounter. It's supposed to be completely out of your hands. I talked to a cancer amputee in the Mount Hope section of the Bronx who said, please, Jesus, send more police. Because the only time she felt safe to go down to her building lobby and pick up her mail was when the police were there, because it was otherwise that lobby was colonized by trespassing youth who were selling drugs, and she was terrified to go down. I would go to police community meetings in the high crime neighborhoods, something that is, you're not allowed, I just learned recently that's a racist term, high crime neighborhood. And I would hear from these good law-abiding people who were trying to run a business that they want more police. And a wonderful elderly lady in a fantastic hat stood up in the 43rd precinct of the Bronx and apropos of nothing said, how lovely when we see the police, they are my friends. So I decided I wanted to give voice to these people, and I also wanted to defend the police. That became for me a moral crusade against the war on cops. And that war on cops came to a head in the aftermath of May 25th, 2020, when 4 Minneapolis police officers arrested a man for passing a counterfeit $20 bill. One of the officers kept his knee on George Floyd's neck and shoulders for 9 minutes while Mr. Floyd was handcuffed on the ground and pleading that he couldn't breathe. Mr. Floyd died of a heart attack during the arrest. The next day, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey announced that whatever the investigation into Mr. Floyd's death revealed, quote, being black in America should not be a death sentence. Mr. Frey's interpretation of Mr. Floyd's end, that it was a function of his race, instantly became universal. That idea was coupled with the claim that Mr. Floyd's death was representative of an epidemic of racially biased police killings of black men. Together, these two claims triggered an explosion of violence in Minneapolis and across the country, destroying thousands of livelihoods, turning city streets into war zones, and ripping apart the very foundation of law and order. Police officers were shot at, slashed, and assaulted with bricks and bottles. Their precinct houses and cruisers were firebombed. Courthouses were vandalized. Firefighters let public and private property burn to the ground rather than risk being attacked by the rioters. Professional thieves used stolen cars as missiles to hurtle into stores, which they then cleared out through the shattered glass. The flames of that terrible week have burned out, but the attack on civil order continues. Monuments to the nation's founders have been torn down and defaced. Police officers are routinely attacked as they try to make a lawful arrest. The unchecked violence of those riots and their long aftermath have sent a clear message to criminals. No one is controlling the streets. Gang shootings and homicides spiked nationwide as a demoralized police force pulled back from discretionary stops and arrests. The year 2020 saw the largest increase in homicides, 29% in the nation's history. Carjackings, follow-home robberies, mass looting became ever more common. This breakdown of safety and order is the direct result of the rush among the nation's elites after the Floyd death to proclaim that policing in the U.S. is lethally racist. A lot is riding then on whether that narrative about the police is correct, not just thousands of lives, but the very possibility of a civilized society. Essential criminal justice practices are being dismantled in the name of fighting alleged law enforcement bias. So is it true, as Joe Biden announced after Mr. Floyd's death, that every time a black person leaves his house, his family members need to fear for his safety from the police? It is not. The idea that the police are wantonly killing black men is a creation of a politicized press and an elite establishment dedicated to the idea that racism is America's defining trait. Today I'm going to examine the evidence for the Black Lives Matter narrative about law enforcement, and let me first give, yes, a trigger warning. I'm going to speak about facts that most Americans would rather turn their eyes away from. They're hard to confront. In an ordinary situation, I might agree with racial etiquette that these should not be broached in public, but the time is too late for that. And let me just say I'm talking about group averages, not any given individual. There are thousands of individuals within underperforming or high crime groups that are not engaged in those behaviors, and you cannot make any assumptions about any individual based on group averages, but let's just look at what is driving averages for policing today. So here's the raw numbers that are used by the Black Lives Matter movement. Every year, the police fatally shoot about 1,000 people, the vast majority of whom are threatening the officer or bystanders with deadly force. The Black Lives Matter folks look at that about 50% of those police fatalities are white, and about 25% are black. The Black Lives Matter folks look at that 25% number and proclaim police bias, since blacks are about 13% of the population. That is the wrong benchmark, however. If there is one thing I want you to take away from my remarks today, it's that the police activity must be measured against crime, not population benchmarks. Every article you read, every news story you watch in the mainstream media will compare police activity to a population benchmark, because that is the only way that the Black Lives Matter narrative can be sustained. Such an analysis ignores the fact that policing today is data-driven. Officers are deployed to where people are most being victimized, and that is in minority neighborhoods. And it is in minority neighborhoods where officers are most likely to interact with armed, violent, and resisting suspects. Here are the victimization data. Nationwide, blacks between the ages of 10 and 24 die of homicide at 24 times the rate of whites in that age cohort, according to the CDC. Larry Elder referred to similar statistics last night. Black juveniles in the post-George Floyd era are shot at 100 times the rate of white juveniles. You might think that the Black Lives Matter activists would care about such attacks on black life, but you would be wrong. They ignore those black victims because they are killed not by the police, not by white supremacists, but by other blacks. Here are the criminal offending data. In the 75 largest U.S. counties, which is where most of the population resides, blacks constitute about 60% of all murder and robbery defendants, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, even though they make up 15% of the population in those counties. Nationwide, blacks commit homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. Now, these crime disparities, and this is the reason I have to talk about them, is they have enormous consequences for police use of force. The biggest determination of officer behavior is civilian behavior, as that young Caribbean man understood. The greater the chance that officers confront armed and resisting suspects, the more likely they are to escalate their own use of force, and that chance is far higher in black communities. So that 25% or so of fatal police shootings each year comprised of black victims, when measured against a crime benchmark, do not support the Black Lives Matter narrative. Well, what about the individual case? Mr. Floyd's death was immediately portrayed as what is known in literary circles as a synecdoche, a part that stands in for the whole, in this case, the whole of anti-black police violence. But if we conclude from that one case that the police are biased against black men, we could just as easily conclude from other individual cases that the police are biased against white men. Who's heard of Edward Bronstein? Okay, Cully's been reading my stuff, or listening. Okay, but Cully, apart from Cully, not many of you, I think. Well, Bronstein died in custody of the California Highway Patrol in March 2020, 2 months before Mr. Floyd's death. The Highway Patrol officers had pulled Bronstein over on suspicion of drunk driving, and then tried forcibly to draw his blood for an alcohol test. During the struggle, he was screaming, "I can't breathe," but the officers persisted in their efforts until he lost consciousness and died. His death was caught on video, but there have been no protests, much less riots about it. In 2016, a 32-year-old schizophrenic named Tony Timpa called 911 in Dallas to report that he was off his medication, frightened and needed help. 3 Dallas police officers responded and kept Timpa face down on the ground for 13 minutes with a knee to his back, all the while joking about Timpa's mental illness. Timpa pleaded for help more than 30 times, exclaiming that the cops were killing him. Eventually, Timpa stopped moving or making any sound as the officers continued their wisecracks, and he died from the physical restraint and from cocaine. Very few Americans outside of Timpa's family know his name. His death did not make international news or spur widespread riots. Unarmed whites have been fatally shot while running at an officer with a spoon, while walking quickly towards an officer during a car stop, while riding away from a grocery robbery store on a bicycle with a hand in their waistband. No one knows their names either. Let's look more closely at unarmed victims of fatal police shootings, something again Larry Elder spoke about last night. In 2021, 8 unarmed black people were slain by police officers, according to the Washington Post. The Washington Post defines unarmed generously to include suspects beating an officer with his own gun or fleeing a car stop with a loaded semi-automatic pistol on the car seat. Those 8 so-called unarmed black people represent 0.00001% of the nation's nearly 47 million self-identified blacks and 0.08% of the 10,000 or so blacks who were murdered by other blacks in 2021. That same year, 73 police officers were killed by criminals. If you apply historical data on the race of cop killers, a police officer in 2021 was about 400 times as likely to be killed by a black male suspect as an unarmed black was to be killed by a police officer. Professional cop bashers like the libertarian Madly Balco routinely proclaim that policing is an extremely safe profession and that police officers deserve no special sympathy for their job risks. But if policing is so safe, then being an unarmed black vis-a-vis the police is really safe, to be precise, 400 times safer than being a police officer vis-a-vis black criminals. Well, what about the counter evidence? What little there is concerns non-lethal police force. But which shows, according to Roland Fryer, that there is a slightly higher chance that blacks will have non-lethal police force used against them than white criminals. But what we also know that's never talked about is blacks resist officers at a higher rate than whites, which would reduce any disparities regarding officer use of non-lethal force. And with the current tidal wave of hatred crashing down upon the police, further delegitimating their authority, suspect resistance is undoubtedly increasing, thereby increasing the chance of police-civilian encounters going bad, of a viral video, and of civil violence. The charge that blacks are routinely at daily risk from white supremacy extends beyond police-civilian interactions to civilian-on-civilian interactions. As LeBron James has tweeted, quote, "We're literally hunted every day, every time we step foot outside the comfort of our homes." Last year, Kansas City Mayor Quinton Lucas alleged that, quote, "merely existing while black can get you shot by a white person." As usual, these sentiments are at odds with the data. Blacks commit 87% of non-lethal interracial violence between blacks and whites and blacks. Now, last night, Elder was reporting on lethal violence. I'm talking about non-lethal because this comes from the National Criminal Victimization Survey run by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. If you're dead, you can't report on who's been attacking you in a non-lethal way. So these statistics refer to everything short of homicide. A black person is 35 times more likely to commit an act of non-lethal violence against a white person as a white person is to commit an act of violence against a black. This black-on-white violence manifests itself in flash mobs, whereby youth rampage throughout downtown business districts, assaulting passerbys and looting stores, in the knockout game, and in the usual brutal armed robberies, many of which have a predatory component. Meanwhile, there is not hardly a single aspect of the criminal justice system that is not being undone in order to avoid disparate impact on black criminals. Everything you find puzzling in law enforcement today can be explained by the desire to avoid disparate impact. Why are felonies being reclassified as misdemeanors? To lessen the number of black felons sent to prison. Why are prosecutors declining to prosecute looting, shoplifting, disorderly conduct, and fare evasion, as Cully is going to amplify upon, to avoid disparate impact? Why is bail being eliminated, gang databases purged, and undercover police units disbanded? Same reason. Because computers are allegedly as racist as people, valuable crime-fighting tools like facial recognition technology and analytical crime software are being mothballed. Police recruiting is over, at least in urban departments. In no other profession are you condemned as a racist by the country's elites from the day you step on the job, a judgment that you cannot clear yourself of. Officers are taking early retirements in droves that are not being replaced. So the law-abiding residents of high-crime neighborhoods are the ones who are paying with their lives, as are dozens of black toddlers who have been gunned down in their bedrooms, front yards, and parents' cars since the Floyd race riots. They are of no import to the Black Lives Matter movement, since their assailants are of the wrong race and do not wear a badge. When Al Sharpton and Benjamin Crump came to Minneapolis to celebrate the first anniversary of Floyd's death, they studiously avoided North Memorial Health Hospital, where two recent victims of Minneapolis's post-Floyd violence were on life support. LaDavion Garrett, 10, was riding in a car with his parents when a gunman opened fire. A bullet pierced his head. Doctors put him in a medically induced coma and removed part of his skull to relieve swelling on his brain. He will be disabled for life. 9-year-old Trinity Addison Smith was jumping on a trampoline at a friend's house when bullets fired from a passing car struck her in the head. She was in the room next to LaDavion's and soon thereafter died. At the same time, Ania Allen, 6, was caught in a shootout between rival gangs while in her mother's car. She died a few days later. None of those children were shot by a cop, despite Biden's outrageous lies about black children being at mortal risk from police officers. If white children were gunned down like black children are, there would be a national revolution. to conclude. It is not just lives at risk in the persistence of the Black Lives Matter narrative. This attack on law enforcement undermines our justice system and fundamental rights. If it continues, we could descend into civil war. It is essential, therefore, to counter the lies about the police with the truth. We must hope that reason still has a place in public discourse. I look to be the people, to be that voice of reason, and I thank you for your attention.
Carol, I thought you liked me, and then you had me follow Heather McDonald. First off, I'll try. First off, you all may remember Sean Hannity saying the country is sanitized. Well, I've been Swainitized. I'm incredibly grateful to you and your wonderful organization for inviting me and giving me the honor and privilege of being on the stage with my colleagues, and Heather, who was kind enough to give a blurb for my book. Just like Robin cut her teeth 50,000 feet above the earth, protecting the country, I cut my teeth in the Navy for 30 years doing criminal justice. I was a prosecutor, I was a defense counsel, I was the deputy chief judge in the Navy Marine Corps trial judiciary, so I saw all sides of the criminal justice system, but most of my time was in the reserves, and so I spent time in San Diego as a civilian prosecutor, in Maryland as a homicide prosecutor, and in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. doing homicides and major crimes. And so I've seen the criminal justice system from the inside out. I have not been a defendant. I don't plan to be one. But let me explain this incredibly pernicious and cancerous movement, the progressive prosecutor movement. And it goes back to something John said last night. This movement operates under two theories, two raison d'etre. One is that the entire criminal justice system is systemically racist, and two, that the only way to change the criminal justice system for the better, in their mind, is to, quote, reverse engineer and fundamentally dismantle, quote unquote, the criminal justice system. That's a quote from Rachel Barkow. She was on the U.S. Sentencing Commission. She's a major cheerleader for the rogue prosecutor movement. Now, I brought props because I want to make a point that I'm not making this stuff up. There is, growing out of the Marxist, anti-capitalist movement, you heard names last night, Stokely Carmichael, Herbert Marcuse. Another one is Angela Davis, all right, and Patrice Cullors, who are deeply connected to BLM. Angela Davis wrote this book, Are Prisons Obsolete? Everyone thinks they're not. Unfortunately, they're a necessary part of a civil society. She, of course, thinks they are obsolete. She has a deep following, a radical, wacky, lefty following, but they are the animating feature behind the progressive prosecutor movement. And let me read a couple things quickly so you understand what they actually believe. Because you actually have to read their stuff to understand how wacky they are. And this is in my book. The first chapter is on the origins, playbook, and belief of the rogue prosecutor movement. She believes that the modern prison, today's prison, is essentially a slave plantation. Her words, not mine. She says that prisons, quote, are racist institutions. Quote, the prison reveals congealed forms of anti-black racism that operate in clandestine ways. In other words, they are rarely recognized as racist. But it's worse. You heard last night from some of the speakers about Black Lives Matter and anti-racism. She says, quote, on page 85 of her book, anti-racist and other social justice movements are incomplete without the attention to the politics, understand that word, politics of imprisonment. So they have a decarceration agenda. And so it started this movement started not after George Floyd. It started way before that. In 2015, when Whitney Tymas and Chloe Cockburn, employees of Soros and ACLU, joined up to unseat 3 pro-death penalty prosecutors in the South. They got $500,000 of Soros money, they got recruits, they unseated those 3, and then they went national. And they went national because they realized this, and this is the one takeaway. If you take away anything from my quick chat, is this. They realized that it's the DA is the gatekeeper to the criminal justice system. It's not the mayor, it's not the governor, it's not the police chief. She and she alone decides who gets prosecuted. They also knew that there's 2,300 elected DAs around the country. 95% of DA races are uncontested, and all of them are low visibility and low dollar races until this movement started. So you can buy yourself a DA for a pretty small amount of money. Now there's 18,000 police departments, there's 2,300 DA offices, there's 94 U.S. attorneys' offices around the country, but the DAs prosecute 90% of the crimes in this country. So they are the gatekeepers. You also have to understand that the last crime tsunami peaked in '92 and came down, has been falling for 30 years. Incarceration rates trail crime rates. The peak ended around 2006, 7, 8, and has been going down dramatically since then. Why? A lot of reasons, but back in 92, 93, we realized you need to address the front end in addition to the back end, the punishment part. So we created drug courts, domestic violence courts, family justice centers, thousands of alternatives to incarceration that have a carrot and stick approach instead of just a stick. And yes, states passed more draconian laws to put the bad guys away, but that's that and lots of other things in civil society, civil organizations, helped drive down crime rates. So in other words, this movement didn't need to happen because crime rates were at historically low rates. But it started because of what they believe. Prison should be abolished. The Brennan Center has called for a 39% reduction in people in prison. The ACLU, not to be outdone, has called for a 50% reduction for people in prison. Understanding, however, real people like us, normal people with a brain, realize that almost 70% of people in prisons are there for violent crime and they have a long criminal record. It's really hard to get put away for long periods of time. You have to work really hard at being a criminal to do that. What is their playbook? This is the key. It's a disaster. And this book is more of a true crime novel focused on 8 cities. LA, San Francisco, Chicago, where the first rogue prosecutor, Kim Foxx, was elected. Kim Gardner in St. Louis, Rachel Rollins in Boston, Larry Bragg in New York, Larry Krasner, one of the worst, in Philadelphia, and Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore. Let me start with real crimes that happened, but for those policies. They would not have happened if the DA had her finger on the pulse and held people accountable. Here's their playbook, and they all operate off the same playbook. Soros has spent $40 million in direct spending on these DAs and $1 billion, with a B, on indirect spending. They're well funded. Number 1, don't prosecute misdemeanors. They're called quality of life crimes. That's what they call it. The quality of life it improves is the criminals, right? But that's what they call it, quality of life. Number 2, don't prosecute juveniles, violent juveniles, as adults. Number 3, water down felonies to misdemeanors. Don't add any sentence enhancements, allegations, etc. to increase the exposure of amount of time. Never ask for life without parole, even in violent cases. Of course, never send a case to the death penalty. Never ask for cash bail. In LA, the largest DA's office in the country, with 1,000 DAs, the DAs aren't allowed to go to parole hearings. So victims themselves have to stare across the table at their perpetrator, and there's no DA to defend keeping that person in jail. It's a disaster. And what has happened? Crime has exploded in the cities with Soros bought and paid for rogue prosecutors. And when you have that toxic trio, to tie into Heather's outstanding remarks, of defund the police or demoralize the police and Soros rogue prosecutors, crime has exploded. Let me show you a few charts, okay? Because crime rates are the Achilles heel of this movement. That's why the voters in San Francisco booted Chesa Boudin in a special election. That's why the voters didn't put Marilyn Mosby back in office in Baltimore. That's why Kim Gardner, besides her incompetence, resigned in disgrace in St. Louis. That's why I think Kim Foxx in Chicago is not running for re-election, because she doesn't want a repeat of the '68 Democratic Convention, because crime needs to get off the front page. Blue on the left are murders in Philadelphia before Larry Krasner was elected. Right is the second he gets elected. This is before 2020, so don't buy the malarkey that COVID alone caused the rise in crime. It happened in cities and Soros Road prosecutors well before that. Look at Chicago. Here is Chicago blue from the crime peak in 1992, murders in Chicago, and then you see it's going down, 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 and then Kim Foxx gets parachuted into office with $1.2 million of Soros money. They are not going to stop. You need to wake up. You need to participate and pay attention to who's running for DA, because your public safety privilege depends on who your DA is. There are good, this may be an apostasy to say this in this crowd, there are actually good, law and order Democrats who are DAs. Jackie Lacey was one in Los Angeles. Anita Alvarez was in Chicago. But this isn't a left or right thing or a blue or red state thing. This is a law and order versus chaos thing. And we deserve law and order. And the irony of this movement, and I'll leave you with this sad fact, the irony of this movement is black lives don't matter to this movement, because they are disproportionately murdered, raped, maimed in the cities where they're supposed to be helped by these prosecutors. And if you buy our book, and I hope you do, you will see that we did a 5-year running average of violent crime in the cities before these DAs were elected and then after. And the numbers just go straight up. So that blood is on their hands. It's their fault. And I hope you buy the book, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Yesterday at 2 p.m., I received a phone call from an inmate incarcerated at the Memphis Federal Prison. His name is Stuart Parks. He is a Christian conservative MAGA supporter. His civil rights have been violated. On January 6, 2021, Stuart walked through an open door to the Capitol and walked around for 20 minutes. When the police asked him to leave, he left. On June 7th of 2021, he was sleeping in his house in Columbia, Tennessee. At 5:55 a.m., 6 FBI agents armed with machine guns broke into his house, put him in his skivvies, and walked him in front of his neighbors to an awaiting van. He was charged with multiple felonies and misdemeanors for that 20 minutes in the Capitol. And he didn't have enough money for a private attorney, and so he was defended by a public defender in Washington, D.C. Now, Stuart, who is a good kid, about 30 years old, Ole Miss grad, a real estate agent, has never had any criminal behavior whatsoever in his life. He looked at the venue there in Washington, D.C. and said, I can't get a fair trial here because 95% of the people here hate Donald Trump. He applied for a change in venue. It was denied. Since he was looking at being tried by a jury in Washington, D.C. that hated his guts, he knew he was not going to be able to get a trial by a jury of his peers. So he said, well, I'll go for a bench trial. The judge, Amit Mehta. Judge Amit Mehta hates people who support Donald Trump. He is an Obama appointee. And at the trial, he convicted Stuart of multiple things and called Stuart a liar. I know Stuart Parks. Stuart Parks is a friend of mine. Stuart Parks is not a liar. At his sentencing, the judge sentenced him to 8 months in federal prison. Stuart then said, well, look, I'm going to appeal. I would like to be free pending appeal. Judge Mehta, showing no mercy, said, no, you're pending appeal, but you're going to prison. And so Tuesday at 2 p.m., Stuart self-reported. And he called me to describe the circumstances there. They're not good. He's 6 foot tall, he's sleeping on a bed that's 5 feet long. The food is bad. The condition is bad. There have been years of smuggling operations that have been run out of this prison. He's in the same prison as murderers and child rapists. And he told me, there's going to be rain here tonight. My roommate has told me we better get ready to bail out because this prison condition is so bad, our cell will be flooded. He had 15 minutes to talk. He was still talking when the phone automatically went off. So we pray for Stuart, but his civil rights have been violated. Now, I bring this up to say this following, and ask this one question. How many of you believe we have a two-tier system of justice in the United States of America? We all do. How can you have a civil society when there is a two-tier system of justice? You can't. This is a problem we're going to talk about in the future. I am a plaintiff in attempting to secure the Covenant Killer Manifesto. It's currently in state court here. Nothing's happened since we filed our lawsuit in May. We're also in federal court. Nothing has happened there. When we get back to our panel, I have some ideas on how we can fix this. It's a long haul, but we'll wait for the panel for that.
I saw what he did there, but I believe in seizing the opportunity. And so I will allow you, Michael, to seize the opportunity. All right, so our last speaker is Pierre Wilson, and he will talk about whatever is on his heart.
Dr. Swain called me her son, so that's gonna stick with me for a while. That's a highlight of my life right there.
Lots of spiritual children, and you're one of them.
I love that. I love that. I appreciate that. You know, really quickly, and I'll be brief. I'm glad she only gave me a couple minutes because she knows I'll talk for an hour if I can. You know, hopefully through the panel, we're going to talk a little bit about what we do in Minority America, especially with the pastors. We talked a lot about, you know, you've heard a lot of numbers around crime and stats, but, you know, we have churches out here who, can you guys hear me good? Yeah. We have churches out here who should be taking the lead role when it comes to what's happening in our communities. We have churches who choose, and they pick and choose what they want to discuss, what they want to talk about, what they want to touch on. And there's violent crimes and things happening around them, and they stay silent. And so a lot of the work that we do through Blexit is we're actually talking to these pastors. We're calling them to come to join the fight, right? So we're putting out a call to action to make sure that they take the lead role. Churches should be a place where people who are trying to change their life come. And unfortunately, and especially in Black America, so many churches have become places where you have to be put together to attend, right? They're judging you from the moment you walk in the door. They're looking at your outfit, the way you talk, the way you handle yourself. Are you married? Are you not married? These should be places where people who are broken come to be healed. And so we're trying to help pastors, particularly in Black America, get back to the healing part, and not the club or the, you know, exclusive team, exclusive society part, right? So, you know, hopefully we talk through that a little bit through the panel, and obviously we do a lot of community work in Black America as well. We've had a chance to talk to some of these individuals who, you know, maybe they were recently released from prison, and it's shocking to us how many, and I'll be quick here, it's shocking to us that we see people who get out and they really have no real direction on how to begin their life and go about it the right way, which is why you see a lot of repeat offenders. Teaching them how to be victims is not going to keep them out of prison. We're just putting them on government programs and all these different, that's not helping them. Helping them is actually getting them to a point where they can rely on themselves. Right, so we teach them skills, life skills, how to actually write a resume, right? So you can try to actually, you know, get interested in that job. If you get a job interview, or if someone is willing to take a chance on you, how do you conduct yourself in that job interview? Things that allow you to make ends meet for yourself. the importance of marriage, the importance of being in your children's life. Not here's a welfare program, here's something that we can get you on, let's get you on. That's not help. That's not real help. That's dependency. So, I'll stop here. Hopefully we kind of touched on a little bit on the panel.
Is there anyone that would like to ask the panelists a question?
Well, just to amplify on Jackson's point about the black church, they're also absolutely silent about family breakdown. And I've heard the explanation is they don't want to alienate the single mothers in their clergy by telling the truth about the catastrophe, as Larry Elder again said last night, that is breakdown. So I don't know, how one turns around the black church to get it more honest about the behaviors that can be changed to improve black outcomes.
Well,
Pierre?
I think I have a comment. I believe that some of that has to do with the
Microphone.
Give her another microphone.
Battery. Take the other microphone. You just use one.
One may be cutting out the other.
Okay. I think some of it has to do with the fact that there's so many pastors that are in bed with the Democratic Party, and if you're part of that, there are certain issues you cannot touch, and they don't want to touch those issues, but it is to the detriment of the black family.
I was going to say really quick, and I challenge everyone in this room too, because I'm going to call out the right a little bit on this one. The Democrats do a better job of outreach, because sometimes it's a matter of showing up, and we are having these conversations. I remember when we went out into these black churches, there were people like, "Oh, you're not gonna change their minds." You'd be surprised how many pastors have said this is the first time someone from this side or this perspective has even come and talked to them. So some of these people who are in bed, with the Democrats, as I agree with Dr. Swain, there's a lot of them that are, it's because the Democrats actually put forth effort and we haven't. So that's part of the reason why we're doing it.
Thank you. Cully, I want to ask you a question because you actually have some experience as a prosecutor, right?
I do.
So, I look at this and, I think everybody in the audience says we live in a two-tier system of justice. To me, I think one of the reasons we have a two-tier system of justice, and you work for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., right?
The very same.
Okay, so Matthew Javert Graves, I use the term Javert, remember Inspector Javert from Les Miserables, who went to the letter of the law and had no concern for justice. So Matthew Graves, to me, is a Javert. And all these judges, federal judges who are former prosecutors, former U.S. attorneys, they don't seem to care about the idea of justice. Now, the instance that I talked about, I think that this judge, he's very well regarded among the left, Amit Mehta. I think he lied on the bench. And in calling Stuart Parks a liar, I give the details, but I believe Stuart, and I think the judge just made this up out of thin air because he hates MAGA people. What kind of actions can we take against U.S. attorneys who are biased and out of control and federal judges who are biased and out of control?
Well, personnel is policy. We all know that. And so if and when, God help us all, we get a Republican back in the White House, the Republican gets to nominate, and the Senate needs to confirm, the 94 U.S. attorneys. The same for the judges. And so you need to put constitutionalists, people on the bench who understand their limited but important role and stay in their lane. I know when I was on the bench for 5 years, when I went to judge school, the first thing they said is, drop your advocate's role. Leave it at the door. And I don't see that happening right now. And judges have an important role in society. So do prosecutors. The problem with these rogue prosecutors is they usurp, they usurp the authority of the legislature by declaring entire categories of crime off limits. Essentially prosecutorial nullification. But you have the one-way ratchet problem, which is what you're referring to. There's a database out there on Lawfare blog that I contribute to every now and then in my national security hat. And they have a list of all the cases. And all the cases for J6, the vast majority of them are trespassing cases. Okay, trespassing on federal government property. No one points out the fact that all these Soros bought and paid for road prosecutors, there's 94 of them out of 2,300, representing 75% of the nation's population, refuse to prosecute trespassing. And so, the Washington Post is never going to talk about it, New York Times will never talk about it, but this is the reality. So personnel is policy, and we need to put constitutionalists on the bench, and we need to get prosecutors who will prosecute fairly and justly, and then use their discretion not to bring cases that they should drop.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Stuart Parks is in prison for 8 months, and frankly, I'm concerned for his safety.
Yeah, well, there's a brotherhood, and that's a gender-inclusive term, in prison, and people tend to take care of each other in prison. But should I be asking the next question, Carol? Do you want me to? Okay.
This is for either Heather or Cully. When you speak, how are you received by blacks and in black communities? Do you find support that wouldn't be evident? I mean, Cully, I don't know how much opposition you receive, but Heather, we know a little bit about what she experiences.
Well, do we call universities a community, or do we call them insane asylums? When I speak at the insane asylum, it is just astounding the intellectual contortions that students undergo in order to deny the reality of black crime. The bodies do not lie. You know, the argument is always, well, if blacks are arrested at higher rates and prosecuted at higher rates, it's because we have racist police that are ignoring all those white criminals. And so the disproportionate policing in prisons is just an epiphenomenon of bias that is shot through the entire criminal justice system. But again, we have a point outside of the system, which is the dead bodies. You can't make this up. As I said, blacks between the ages of 10 and 24 die of homicide at 24 times the rate of whites in that cohort. That's not because of police bias. The police wish against hope every time they're called to a shots fired call, meaning somebody's been shot, that for once they'll be given the description of a white shooter. It virtually never happens in urban America. In the New York City, blacks and Hispanics commit about 98% of all shootings. So the police cannot go where people are being victimized without being in minority neighborhoods. The students will just make up explanations for that somehow we're just ignoring white crime. Believe me, we're not. I mean, what's amazing about this, I look with awe. I mean, the press is definitely racist. They do not care about black lives. I look and I say, what determines, if there's some white girl who is abducted, you know, Joy Reid of MSNBC has been right once in her life. Do you remember that case of that couple where the girl disappeared? They were out camping in some national forest and everybody got all upset because a white girl had been abducted and disappeared. And this was like this national obsession. And Joy Reid talked about the missing white girl syndrome. She's right. We do not give a damn about those black victims. And neither do the kids in the schools. They don't give a damn. They would rather perpetuate their narrative about white police racism and white court racism than actually do something to try and save those black lives. So what I've encountered is just complete denial, or, you know, well, you need a theory for why. If you're going to say that the reason that cops have more interactions with blacks is because they have a exponentially higher rate of black crime, you need a theory for that. No, I don't. I'm just going to give you the facts. And that's what matters.
But how are those facts received by regular people, like regular black folks, or do you not have opportunities to interact with them?
Well, my main interaction is, as I say, in like police community meetings in the inner city. And they're pretty, I think, pretty aware of the crime that's going on. and want the police to do something. I mean, we're all sophisticated law students. Well, we just know that it's unconstitutional to enforce loitering laws or truancy laws. And what I hear always like from these good law-abiding people is, there's kids hanging out by the hundreds on the corner fighting. Why can't you do something about it? Whatever happened to truancy and loitering laws? And the poor police chief from the 41st precinct had said, well, we can't really do that anymore because the Supreme Court said it would be racist to do so. So they want the law to be enforced, and the police often have their hands tied.
I'm really glad you asked that question, because when I would go out to homicide scenes in DC, I went out to all my homicide scenes, or in Maryland, or when I was in the Navy, really bad crime scenes, and they were in black neighborhoods. To the extent people would come up and talk to you, or want to talk to you in a place where no one could see them talking to you, they would tell you, we need more police in our neighborhood. We don't want fewer police in our neighborhood. We want police that look like us, police we trust, but they know who the criminals are in the neighborhood. And they really complain. When we were writing this book, we were in LA, in a lot of tough neighborhoods. They really complained about cashless bail. They're like, what neighborhoods do you think these people come back to? You think they go to Hollywood or Chevy Chase, Maryland, or some swanky part of New York City? No, they come back to the hood where they're from, and they terrorize us. So the ones that I get the most pushback from are the self-loathing liberals, whites. And heads almost exploded this week when I was in Texas, at University of Texas Law School. And because one of the little law students who was reading from a script, self-loathing liberal type, was complaining about mass incarceration, so-called mass incarceration. And I talk about it in this book, and my next book is coming out on it. And I said, do you realize that Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow, includes in her number of mass incarceration people who are not incarcerated? And she said, what? I said, yeah, there are people under correctional control. And you understand also that half the people she talks about in the mass incarceration bucket are people in jail, local jail, and that on average, they serve 23 days in jail. And they don't like facts. It's like water on the Wicked Witch of the West. I'm melting. What they're really good at is pulling at the emotional heartstrings by telling stories. And I think that's where we need to be better at talking about victims and the real victims of these policies, because they come in all shapes, sizes, and colors, and most of them are blacks. And so that's why we started our book with stories, because we just got to push back and punch hard and be the people and be in their face with the stories and the facts.
My question is, storytelling seems to be a very interesting part of the whole movement that's going on in this country. How do we combat storytelling except telling our own narratives?
I think what you're talking about is media storytelling, right? And you have media narratives. I actually think, I'm going to give a note of optimism here. If you listen to the regime media, CBS, NBC, ABC, Washington Post, New York Times, you get the same narrative. I mean, it's almost brain dead, right? It's almost like somebody who's in academia who believes in honesty and integrity. You got no chance in the current institutional system. I'm going to give you a really positive look at that. Look, there's alternative media growing all over the United States of America. And I think the very best guy doing this is my good buddy, Stephen K. Bannon on War Room. Let me tell you something. If you've not listened to War Room, you're going to get information. You're not going to get anywhere. I know Heather's been on War Room, I think. But you can get the straight truth there on War Room. But there's others, the John Frederick's Radio Network. Now the largest independent, which is our station here in Nashville, largest independent network out there. And then you look around, there are all sorts of video casts like the Timcast and Joe Rogan, and you're getting more and more of this out there. So I think, now, would you like some really good news?
Yes.
The Los Angeles Times, which is basically, a communist propaganda entity, is doing so poorly financially, they just laid off 140 people. The Jeffrey Bezos newsletter, formerly known as the Washington Post, is not doing well, and they're laying off people. So I'm going to give you some hope. You know, support conservative media like the Star News Network and the Tennessee Star, but I think it's looking really good going forward.
And I'd like to say about the storytelling, that it reminds me of the scripture in Revelation that you probably can quote, where they overcame them by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they didn't love their lives unto death. And so telling that story, we all have a story to tell. You need to learn how to tell your story in less than 3 minutes, or make your pitch, Michael. In less than 3 minutes. But we all have a story, and we can tell our stories, and we do lose to the left because they can always give a sympathetic tale, and that's how they can get it over on us. Pierre needs to leave. Is there anyone who has a question for him before he leaves? Here's a flight. All right, back there.
I'm a minister in Atlanta, Georgia. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm a minister in Atlanta, Georgia for 30 years. I've been in prison ministry for about 30 years. I'm on the board for the youth detention in Cobb County. I have been telling them that you cannot release these young people back out to their streets. Either the churches need to do something, have the pastors waiting on the doorsteps, or the gangs, they're going to get them back, because I've seen repeat after repeat after repeat. What can I do? Because I'm fighting this. Like, no, churches, we've got to be there for these young people when they get out. Go to their homes, get their zip code. Churches in the zip code area. Help the young people. They're crying out for help. When children tell me, Miss Elizabeth, I'd rather be in jail than on the streets. I am shot at. The big kids are giving the little kids drugs to do their business. I open up free Christian schools in Atlanta, Georgia for poor children. Babies are being shot in crossfire. One of my students got shot. So what can I do as a minister to speak up? Because I have a big mouth.
Yeah, well, we need big mouth people. I mean, I got a big mouth too.
Yeah.
I think we need to connect, number one. I think it'd be great for us to connect with each other. You know, what she said really quickly is super important. We hear that a lot too. A lot of people would rather be in jail than to be out in the street because they're like, I have a bed.
Yes.
You know, a place that I'm not getting shot at.
Yes, that's what they say.
A lot of people don't realize that, and when I tell people that, they're like, "Oh my gosh, that can't be true." I'm like, "You would be surprised of how many people will say that." So they don't fear. Jail is almost like a step up for some of them. And it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. I think the biggest thing is that we need to teach them what or help show them what the American dream is like. And without really going into my full story, because I know we don't have the time, but I changed my own life, right? The country didn't change for me. I was very much aligned with the left for so many years. I changed my own life. I got red pilled, as they call it, and I took accountability and responsibility for my own actions. And so when I speak to these people who are coming out of jail, I never went to jail myself, but I understand what it's like to have a victimhood mentality, to think that this country isn't built for you. And a lot of them believe that. They believe their life is just the hood.
Yes.
And we want to show them a better way. So we do that by teaching them basic skills. It sounds simple, writing a resume, job. These things may sound simple to you all, but it's not simple to them. It's things that they have never been taught. They've only been taught how to depend on someone. They've been told probably from a young age that this country isn't built for them, or people who look like them. And that victimhood mentality takes root inside of them, and they end up making bad decisions. So we're rewiring them in a way to believe in themselves, believe that they can accomplish things, and we have thousands of examples within Blexit to be able to prove that we've done it ourselves. So yeah, we should connect and work together. Churches need to be on the front lines of this, not government, not anyone. Churches need to be leading the way in changing the communities out there.
Yes, thank you.
God bless you, by the way, for working.
Yeah, the question from Laura is, why do I think it's necessary to have the Covenant Killer Manifesto public? Well, it's the law. The Freedom of Information Act allows me to request that because I'm in the press. And it is black letter law. So the reason it should be out there is because we have a free society with First Amendment, freedom of the press, and I have a legal right to obtain that. That's why it should be out there.
And Michael Patrick Leahy, this begs the question, what is hidden in those pages?
I don't know. As you know, the 3 pages were leaked to Stephen Crowder and released. I will tell you, what those pages revealed were not what the police department said was in it. Right? There's animus, anti-Christian elements to it, the whole transgender thing which is referenced. I suspect that there's something that they want to hide and keep from us. The law is very clear. We should have that manifesto, and we will ultimately, sometime within my lifetime.
One of the things I want to say about the handling of that particular crime is that the young woman who was a trans male, she had an autopsy. They did not test for prescription drugs. She may have been on testosterone, which makes people more aggressive, but we'll never know because they buried her without testing for that drug.
Thank you. So, a lot of the issues that arise in, minority neighborhoods regarding crime, regarding those other problems, a lot of it can be boiled down to culture, right? We know black people, Asians, et cetera, they aren't born. Like, I'm not born to be a criminal, right? It's a cultural aspect, right? Well, some of it could be cultural. There could be some external factors that we have that could contribute to that. So what do you think we could do? What do you think those external factors could be? And if they are there, what do you think we can do about it to fix them? Any of you, if you know.
Big question and touchy subject. Frankly, I'm going to be very blunt here. We, as a group, have been trying to change this for decades. There's no shortage of efforts at social uplift programs. They've been misguided often, but there's been an effort. At this point, my conclusion, and Dr. Swain may disagree with me, is that the change has to come from within that culture. There has to be, above all, a rejection of the anti-acting white ethic that says that to put an effort out to learn, to take your textbooks home and study, that is a capitulation to white culture. Parents have to step up to the plate. And yes, there's a lot of good conservative solutions out there, vouchers, charter schools. We've been talking about those for decades. And of course, we should continue talking about them. But there is only so much that groups on the outside can do to change that culture. The change has to come from within, and that's why people associated with being people are so important. What we can do is amplify their voices. But frankly, it is a very, I'm going to be very blunt here again. The inner city culture is completely pathological. You can hear it in the rap music. Remember, there was that brief period in the 90s when Tipper Gore was having us listen to these rap lyrics, and as usual, America turns its eyes away. It does not want to look at how bad things are. We would rather, as a society, blame ourselves for phantom white supremacy than speak honestly about how self-destructive black inner city culture is. We hear the racism of rap lyrics. We hear the misogyny. We hear the glorification of violence. There has to be a correction against that.
I would just add another aspect that we really don't talk about much, although I've been writing about it recently, and I have a major paper coming out on it, and that is the commoditization of the racial industrial complex. I mean, you look at my book on Amazon, it's in the hundreds or 200s, right? you look at in that category, Angela Davis's book, Michelle Alexander's book, all these other people's books, and there is a profit incentive to keep stirring this pot and trying to divide us and divide us between oppressors and oppressed. And so, in addition to the cultural pieces, and I'll be very interested in hearing what Dr. Swain has to say, because I would defer to her for her long and distinguished work in this area, there is a financial incentive not to give it up on their side.
I can tell you that I have been speaking for years about the things that are dysfunctional in minority communities. And even though you know my story, high school dropout, rural poverty, a lot of dysfunction, but at home I did not hear that I was a victim. I was not taught to hate white people. I was taught to believe, whether this came from the time I was in school or the family, that in America, if you worked hard, you could make something of yourself. But it was always the emphasis on you. And the crime that you see in the black community, the dysfunction in the families, that was not always the way. In the 1960s, we saw it accelerate because of progressive policies. And I think that for Black America to change and for the crime rate to drop and for America to have better race relations, we have to have something that we're not having at all, and it's honest conversations about race and about the statistics that Heather presented today. I mean, you can't talk about that, yet we all should be talking about it. When we see these heinous crimes, we see on X or Twitter, all of these videos of black people behaving like animals, we need to condemn that. And I think some of us do, the bravest white people do, the conservative blacks do. It's an embarrassment, it's a setback, and we can do better. And so I will leave you with that. I'd like to thank my panelists, and we have a lot of work to do.